midnight. To this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Ozarks history, I welcome you. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments the place you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. Where these documented accounts reach, the places and the times of day or night, we're interested to know. 020. During the summer of 1964, a series of documents was discovered in the basement of the Douglas County Historical Society by a doctoral student from the University of Missouri. Separated from the main archives, the records had been kept in a metal box with a simple label, Hensley, not for public record. 041. Inside that box, what Sarah Calloway found would lead her down a path few researchers have dared to follow since. Fragments of county records, newspaper clippings, and personal correspondence dating back to 1887 were contained within it, all centered around two sisters from Ava, Missouri, whose names had been methodically erased from most official documents. 103. What might be one of the most disturbing chapters in Ozark history, one that local authorities have seemingly tried to suppress for generations, we piece together today. The rolling hills of southern Missouri, where the White River cuts through limestone valleys and dense oak forests create shadows even on the brightest days, are where the story begins. 126, along what is now County Road 14, approximately 12 miles southeast of Ava, was where the Hensley family established their homestead in 1879. According to land records, 80 acres of farmland were purchased by Thomas Hensley, a Civil War veteran from Tennessee, who built a two-story farmhouse that stood until 1967, when it burned under circumstances that local newspaper accounts described only as unfortunate. 158. A place of isolation and self-reliance were the Ozarks in the late 19th century. Difficult travel was made by the rugged terrain, with most roads being little more than dirt paths that became impassable during heavy rains. Tight-knit by necessity were the communities, dependent on one another for survival through harsh winters and unpredictable harvests. 220. In a landscape that could be as unforgiving as it was beautiful, structure and comfort were provided by religious faith. Within a 20-mile radius, it was common for families to live their entire lives, their world defined by the ridges and valleys that surrounded them. For the Confederacy during the Civil War, Thomas Hensley had fought, serving in the 8th Tennessee Infantry. 245. At the Battle of Nashville in December 1864, military records indicate he was captured and spent the remainder of the war in a Union prison camp in Illinois. What period doctors called soldier's heart, what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, was what this experience reportedly left him with. In letters between his wife Margaret and her sister in Kentucky, night terrors and periods of melancholy were noted. 312. Described as hardworking and determined to build a new life in Missouri after the war was Thomas, despite these challenges. 5 children were had by Thomas and Margaret Hensley, 3 sons, James, born 1862, William, born 1864, and Thomas Jr., born 1866, and 2 daughters, Eliza, born 1868, and Ruth, born 1872. 338, alongside their father worked the sons, clearing the land and establishing a modestly successful farm, primarily growing corn and raising hogs. Local women were married by both James and William, who established homesteads nearby, while on the family property Thomas Jr. remained, apparently content to continue working under his father's direction. 4 o'clock, but to the 2 youngest Hensley children, Eliza and Ruth, our focus turns. As fair of face with eyes of striking blue clarity, Eliza is described by the church records from First Baptist Church of Ava, while a pleasant countenance and disposition to match were noted for Ruth. At the local schoolhouse until the 8th grade, which was common for rural children of that era, both girls were educated. 428, in her class records, their teacher, Miss Abigail Whitmore, noted that an uncommon aptitude for mathematics and natural philosophy was displayed by Eliza, while particular talent in composition and recitation was shown by Ruth. On consecutive Sundays in the summer of 1882, according to the baptismal records, both girls were baptized in Bryant Creek. 455, as joyous occasions for the entire congregation, Reverend Blackwood's notations describe the events, with Eliza receiving the Spirit with quiet dignity and Ruth embracing her salvation with visible emotion. To how they would later be characterized in private correspondence between local officials, these descriptions stand in stark contrast. 519, during these years, a respectable position in the community was maintained by the Hensley family. For 2 terms beginning in 1883, Thomas served on the county commission, focusing particularly on road improvements and the establishment of a county poorhouse for indigent residents. Throughout the area for her knowledge of medicinal plants was Margaret known, often called upon to treat everything from fevers to difficult childbirths when the county doctor was unavailable. 548, church regularly was attended by the family, contributions were made to community events, and by all public accounts, the pioneering spirit of the Ozarks was embodied. Yet behind this facade of rural normalcy, early indications that all was not well with the Hensley sisters were there. A concerning passage is contained in a letter from Margaret to her sister in 1885. 6:16, at unusual hours, Eliza continues to wander the property. Merely youthful restlessness is what Thomas believes it is, but something in her expression lately troubles my heart. Of dreams so vivid they cannot be distinguished from waking life, she speaks. Her sister in all things is followed by Ruth, which compounds my worry. From the journal of Emily Bradford, a childhood friend of Eliza's, comes another hint. 6:42, in an entry from September 1886, she writes, "For quilting or social gatherings, Eliza no longer joins us. When I called at the Hensley farm yesterday, her daughter was indisposed," said Mrs. Hensley, "but from upstairs I heard Eliza's voice reciting something in words I could not recognize. About it later at the general store, when I asked Ruth, she grew pale and said, 'Mistaken I must have been.'" 707, but in the spring of 1887, everything changed dramatically. On April 17 of that year, the records show that Thomas Hensley abruptly resigned from all public duties, citing only pressing family matters in his letter to the county clerk. Immediately thereafter, the family stopped attending church. That Mrs. Hensley would only accept goods left at the end of their long gravel driveway was reported by delivery men. 728, within 6 months, altogether left Missouri the 2 oldest Hensley sons, James for Colorado, William for Oklahoma Territory. To Douglas County according to available records, neither would ever return. At the farm remained the youngest son, Thomas Jr., until November 1887, when a position on a riverboat working the Mississippi he accepted. 756, in the Ava Monitor with the brief statement was noted his departure. T. Hensley, Jr. has taken employment upon the waters, leaving behind the troubles that have beset his family in recent months. Of the few public acknowledgements that anything unusual was occurring at the Hensley farm, this represents one. 829, the beginning of a slow unraveling, one that the local authorities would later go to extraordinary lengths to keep hidden, was what happened in the Hensley household during the spring of 1887, suggest the pages from Sarah Calloway's discovery. Abruptly in December 1887 ends the documentation, then resumes in March 1888 with a curious entry in the county doctor's log, visited Hensley farm at T. request. Observe the situation. No medical intervention possible or advisable. Recommended isolation protocol as per discussion with Sheriff Taylor. 855, by time and intentional obfuscation remains partially obscured what transpired on that farm. But the chilling reality of what locals would later call the burden of the Hensley sisters, a burden so heavy that an entire community conspired to erase it from memory, we can begin to piece together through these fragmented records, newspaper clippings, and personal accounts. 918, from a letter written by the local postmaster to his counterpart in Springfield, comes the earliest indicator that something was amiss. Dated May 9, 1887, it contains a passing reference. Quite a stir has been caused by the strange affair with the Hensley girls, though we are all committed to discretion in the matter. The sheriff's request regarding any official correspondence to that address, I trust you will honor. 938, this arrangement is confirmed by a follow-up letter from the Springfield postmaster dated May 16. As you requested, I have instructed my staff. Separately will be held all mail for the Hensley residents and delivered only to Sheriff Taylor or his designated deputy. About the nature of these precautions I confess curiosity, but respect the need for discretion in sensitive matters. 1001, in any surviving documents is not explicitly stated what exactly this strange affair entailed. However, a disturbing entry from June 1887 is contained in a diary belonging to Miriam Jenkins, the wife of a neighboring farmer. 1025, at Whitmore's general store today saw Margaret Hensley, first time in nearly 2 months. As though she hadn't slept in weeks, she looked. When I inquired about the girls, she simply shook her head and said, "We don't speak of them anymore." On her wrists were bruises. A subsequent entry in the Jenkins diary dated June 23 adds, "From delivering a cord of wood to the Hensley place returned Joseph. At the property line met him Thomas," he said, "and wouldn't allow him any closer to the house. In a tin on a fence post was left payment. What sounded like singing coming from behind the house, but in no language he could identify, Joseph said he heard. To Thomas, when he mentioned it, as white as linen went the man's face." 1113, through the small communities dotting the Ozark Hills began to circulate rumors as summer gave way to fall. In town or at church gatherings were no longer seen the Hensley Sisters, once visible members of the community. Speculation was generated by their absence, but according to multiple accounts, clear that inquiries about the Hensley family were discouraged was made by Sheriff James Taylor. 1137, as a practical, no-nonsense lawman was known Sheriff Taylor, who had served Douglas County since 1881. Precisely because it contrasted with his usual transparent approach to community matters stood out his reluctance to discuss the Hensley situation. A tense exchange is recorded in a county commissioners' meeting minutes from September 1887 when Commissioner Harold Whitley asked directly about the situation with Commissioner Hensley's family. 1206, simply as, "That matter is being handled appropriately and is not for public discussion," is recorded Sheriff Taylor's response. "I would remind the Commissioner that some aspects of maintaining public order require discretion." At the growing unease hints a letter from Reverend William Blackwood to a colleague in Jefferson City dated October 1887. 1230, "3 times I have tried to call upon the Hensley family, concerned for their spiritual welfare after such a prolonged absence from our congregation. At the property line has met me Thomas each time, rifle in hand, insisting that his family requires no spiritual guidance at this time. Of a home at peace with God are not those sounds coming from that house, brother." 1250, the letter continues, "On my last attempt, as I was turning to leave, at an upstairs window I glimpsed movement. Against the glass was pressed a pale face. One of the daughters, though which I could not discern, rapidly was moving her mouth, as if an urgent communication, but the window was closed, and nothing I heard. My gaze saw Thomas and fired his rifle into the air, commanding me to leave and never return. For what transpires in that household, I feared greatly." 1314, by winter, a place locals avoided had become the Hensley farm. Not to venture near the property were warned children. Decreasing traffic saw the road passing their land, once a common route to Ava, as longer alternate paths were chosen by people. 1339, in the tight-knit Ozark community, an island of isolation was becoming the Hensley property. From the Ava school teacher to the county superintendent requesting guidance on how to respond to troubling tales being spread by the children is a curious document from this period. 2 p.m., nightmares involving the Hensley girls have been reported by several students despite having no recent contact with the family. Disturbingly similar are the descriptions, the sisters standing at the edge of the forest, beckoning them to follow toward a cave. This morbid fascination I have attempted to discourage, but the stories persist. To the children and their parents, is there an official position I should communicate? 1421, telling is the superintendent's response, preserved in the school district archives, that spreading frightening stories is unchristian behavior. You are to inform the children. Disciplinary action will face any student continuing to discuss the Hensley family. Of those who have been most persistent in this matter, please provide me with the names as their parents may require direct counsel from Sheriff Taylor. 1442, from December 1887, an unusual entry is contained in the county records, a request from Thomas Hensley to the county commissioners to approve the construction of an outbuilding with specialized reinforcements on his property. 1507, without the usual public discussion was approved the request, and a notation indicates that by the county itself rather than the local lumber mill were delivered the materials. Iron fixtures and soundproofing measures that would have been highly unusual for a typical farm structure of that era were included in the building specifications. 1528, that the materials for this outbuilding cost substantially more than typical farm structures of the period is revealed by an expense ledger found in the county archives. The itemized list includes 6 iron restraint fixtures, $14.25, and 30 yards acoustical batting, $27.81, along with specialized door hinges and locking mechanisms, $22.35. 1554, for the time, a significant expenditure represented these items and suggest a structure designed for confinement rather than agricultural purposes. Largely undocumented is what happened during the winter of 1887 to 1888. Dramatically has shifted the tone when the records resume in March. With a flurry of activity involving county officials coincides the county doctor's cryptic note about isolation protocol. 1623, for special duty at Hensley property for 2 weeks in March 1888, payments to 3 men are shown by an expense ledger. A single entry is contained in the sheriff's log, Hensley matter resolved as agreed. No further documentation necessary or recommended. For immediate approval for transport of special charges to the state facility at Farmington requests a letter from Sheriff Taylor to Judge Wilson dated March 20, 1888. 1653, the same day written, the judge's response grants approval and adds, that this unfortunate situation demands extraordinary measures, I concur. As discussed, I have telegraphed the governor's office. That this resolution brings peace to the afflicted and safety to our community, let us pray. 1719, from an unlikely source comes the next significant mention of the Hensley Sisters, the personal papers of Dr. Arthur Simmons, superintendent of the Missouri State Asylum in Farmington, some 160 miles east of Ava. With the notation transferred from Douglas County under special arrangement with Sheriff Taylor. No prior documentation to be maintained. Secure ward placement as per Governor's Office Directive, lists patient HE and patient HR a patient register from April 1888. 1743, a disturbing entry about the new patients is contained in Dr. Simmons's private journal, which was not discovered until after his death in 1905. From Douglas County, the sisters arrived today. For their condition I was not adequately prepared despite Sheriff Taylor's warnings. That defy straightforward medical explanation exhibits patient physical anomalies. While physically unremarkable, patient displays linguistic abnormalities that suggest profound cognitive disruption. Unlike any I have previously encountered demonstrate both hostile behavior. To their care I have assigned our most experienced attendants and ordered restraints at all times. 1832, a subsequent entry dated 2 weeks later adds, in ways that contradict established medical understanding continues to deteriorate patient E's physical condition. In my 20 years of psychiatric practice have no precedent the changes observed in the dermal layer and ocular structures. To affect similar symptoms has begun patient R, suggesting either a shared pathology or some form of mimicry. The effect their presence has on other patients in proximity is more concerning still. Reassignment have requested 3 attendants, citing disturbing dreams. To the isolation wing in the East Building I have moved both sisters. 1859, here hit a significant obstacle Sarah Calloway's research. Denied were repeatedly her requests to access records from the Farmington Asylum. In her notes, she writes that off the record told her a clerk at the state archives that certain patient records from that era had been segregated under executive order in 1928 and were not available for scholarly research. The clerk allegedly added, in the Ozarks are better left some stories from the Ozarks. 1922, by this roadblock frustrated, Calloway expanded her research to include the personal papers of individuals connected to the Farmington Asylum. In the collected correspondence of Dr. Harrison Wells, a physician who worked at the facility from 1886 to 1893, she found a letter to his brother that contained a passing reference to the Hensley Sisters, from the southern counties, 2 patients whose condition defies classification we received. From the general population has sequestered them Dr. Simmons and few staff members are permitted contact. To confidentiality have been sworn those of us who conducted the initial examination. But this much I will say, so readily I no longer dismiss the folk beliefs of rural communities. Scientific explanation resists some phenomena. 2021, on their farm continued to live the Hensley parents, increasingly reclusive with each passing year. According to tax records, ownership of the property was maintained, but much of their farmland was allowed to go fallow. The Hensley house as in advancing state of disrepair, curtains drawn at all hours, described as census takers' unofficial notes from 1890, adding, extremely aged beyond her years appeared Mrs. H, refused to answer questions about family members. 2044, Into the Family's State of Mind offers a rare glimpse, a letter from Margaret Hensley to her sister in Kentucky, dated September 1890. Why we have been so long silent, I know you cannot understand. Even now I cannot explain. Ours alone is the burden we bear, by necessity if not by choice. Most nights wakes Thomas screaming. Before their empty rooms I find myself standing, listening for sounds I pray never to hear again. What was necessary we have done. May God forgive us, for myself I cannot forgive. 2136, on the property remained the outbuilding constructed in 1888, though unclear is its purpose following the removal of the Hensley Sisters. Its presence is noted by a property tax assessment from 1892, but describes it as unused and secured. That the structure was bad luck and to be avoided at all costs were told children, suggest local oral histories collected by Callaway. 2209, in 1896 died Thomas Hensley according to county death records. Simply as natural decline is listed the cause. By only 7 months survived him Margaret. Notably brief is the obituary for Thomas in the Ava Monitor, mentioning only his military service and tenure as county commissioner. As survivors it names his 3 sons, but makes no mention of daughters. 2234, similarly abbreviated is Margaret's obituary, describing her only as a devoted wife and mother, with no specific mention of her children. Might have closed the chapter on the Hensley family, their deaths, but what happened next only deepened the mystery. To settle the estate arrived following Margaret's death distant relatives from Tennessee. 2256, according to a letter from the county clerk to the probate judge, upon inspection of the property were visibly disturbed these relatives, particularly the outbuilding that had been constructed in 1888. Without claiming any inheritance departed they within days of their arrival, instructing the county to dispose of the property as it saw fit. 2317, later wrote to the county clerk one of these relatives, a cousin named Edward Hensley, requesting that his visit to Ava be struck from all official records and stating that he wished no association whatsoever with the property or its contents. Cryptically he added, "Of God or nature as I understand them was not the work what dwelled in that outbuilding. Of what we witnessed there have instructed my family never to speak." 2342, in a transaction that several local historians have noted as unusual, was purchased the farm by the county itself. What happened next was more unusual still. Immediately was demolished the outbuilding. On site were burned the materials. For almost 2 years remained vacant the main house before being sold to a family from Illinois who reportedly had no connections to the area and no knowledge of the property's history. 2400 hours 15, 4 sanitation and purification measures at the former Hensley property before its sale to the new owners contains entries a county expense ledger. That 5 men worked for 3 days at the site with additional expenses for lime, coal oil, and combustible materials is indicated by the ledger. For these measures is provided no further explanation. 2400 hours 38, in 1964, during the research for her doctoral thesis, Sarah Callaway attempted to locate any surviving records from the Farmington Asylum regarding the Hensley sisters. That a fire in 1919 had destroyed many patient records she discovered, but not before some had been transferred to the state archives in Jefferson City. Denied were her repeated requests to access these records. 25:03, in her research notes, Callaway writes, "Normal bureaucratic resistance goes beyond the pattern of denial and obstruction I've encountered. When I mentioned the names Eliza and Ruth Hensley to the archivist, his entire demeanor changed. He informed me that for reasons of public welfare remain classified certain historical records and suggested that by selecting a different research topic would be better served my academic future." 25:31, but determined, frustrated, Callaway shifted her approach. Elderly residents of Douglas County she began interviewing, hoping to find someone who remembered the Hensley family. About them at all refused to speak most. Only in vague terms spoke those who did offer comments, often ending conversations abruptly when pressed for details. 25:54, however, yielded a significant lead one interview. With Ezekiel Thornton, who was 93 years old in 1964 and had served as a deputy under Sheriff Taylor as a young man, spoke Calloway. Though initially reluctant, Thornton eventually revealed that one of the men paid for special duty at the Hensley property in March 1888 he had been. 26:17, haltingly about those 2 weeks spoke Thornton, according to Calloway's notes, in that house, what we found wasn't right. More than anything were scared the parents. Of their own daughters scared they were. With small things, it started, they said, items moving about the house when no one was near them. Then the voices at night, then the dead animals. Of what we saw in that back bedroom, never to speak made us swear sheriff. But this I'll tell you, right anymore didn't look those girls. Didn't sound right either. All wrong, eyes. The things they said. From their own children, such things no one should have to hear. 26:40, for more specific details, when pressed, became agitated Thornton. The older one, Eliza, changes in her face she had, in her skin, things that shouldn't be possible. And the things she knew, things about each of us that no one could know. Secret things, shameful things. With a smile that wasn't human, she'd whisper them to you. And Ruth, like her sister she was becoming, changing a little more each day. At night, the sounds they made together, like nothing on this earth. 27:02, what had happened to cause the change in the sisters, when Calloway asked, would only say Thornton, the cave some blamed. The book they found there some blamed. About that I don't know. What I saw I just know. And after we took them away, help board up a cellar entrance out back of the property made us sheriff. Boarded it up and then covered it over completely. From that dark place again said nothing good would ever come. 27:27, with several new avenues of inquiry provided Calloway this interview. No official documentation of a cave on the Hensley property appears. However, that the area southeast of Ava contains numerous limestone caves and sinkholes confirm geological surveys of Douglas County, many of which remain unexplored or incompletely mapped even today. 27:48, for its karst topography is particularly known the Bryant Creek watershed, which runs near the former Hensley property, where underground water has carved extensive cave systems through soluble rock layers. Equally intriguing was the mention of a book. That Thomas Hensley's grandfather had been a prominent minister in eastern Tennessee, known for his extensive library of theological texts, revealed Calloway's research into the Hensley family background. 28:17, several of these volumes, including what one letter describes as ancient texts acquired during grandfather's missionary work in the Mediterranean, suggests family correspondence Thomas inherited. To the archives of the Tennessee Historical Society led Calloway's investigation, where records of Reverend Josiah Hensley's travels to Greece and Turkey in the 1820s she located. 28:47, that he returned with 7 crates of antiquities and manuscripts indicates a ship's manifest, though their specific nature is not detailed. That Reverend Hensley was later involved in a doctrinal dispute with his denomination's leadership and was removed from his position under circumstances described only as a regrettable necessity for the spiritual welfare of the congregation show church records. 29:13, to the Ozarks with Thomas Hensley could one of these manuscripts have found its way? And to what happened to his daughters in the spring of 1887 could it somehow be connected? A connection there was believed she, Calloway's notes suggest, though the exact nature remained elusive. 29:40, Martha Whitmore, whose grandfather had owned the general store in Ava during the 1880s, recalled hearing about the Hensley sisters as a child, another interview subject. Of them directly wouldn't speak my grandfather, but I remember overhearing him tell my father that when those girls found something that should have stayed buried began the tragedy. That the older one changed first and then began to change her sister, he said. Walking into the hills southeast of town toward what locals called the Devil's Punch Bowl, a sinkhole that supposedly led to a cave system, they'd been seen at night, he said. 30:07, in June 1964 took a concerning turn Calloway's research. From 2 state officials who inquired about her research topics and requested that she be directed toward more productive areas of historical inquiry reported receiving a visit her faculty advisor. When she continued her investigation, that the metal box containing the Hensley documents had been removed from the Historical Society found Calloway. 30:35, That the materials had been transferred to the state archives for preservation purposes was the official explanation. Undeterred, to Jefferson City traveled Calloway to request access to these materials. That no such transfer had been recorded was she informed. When she returned to Ava, that she had perhaps been confused about the contents of the archive basement suggested the Historical Society director. 31:03, in a particularly troubling development, that her apartment in Columbia had been searched during her absence, reported Calloway. Taken was nothing, but clearly had been examined her research notes. That she had likely left her door unlocked suggested campus police, dismissing her concerns. 31:29, thereafter began she to receive anonymous telephone calls late at night. Never spoke the caller, but would breathe heavily for several minutes before disconnecting, according to her roommate. These intimidation tactics persisted Calloway. To Farmington traveled she to view the grounds of the former state asylum, hoping to locate personnel records that might identify staff members who had contact with the Hensley Sisters. 31:51, archives dating back to the facility's founding contained the administration building, but was denied access Calloway. However, to Harold Wilson, a retired attendant who had worked at the asylum from 1895 to 1932, directed her a sympathetic clerk. In his 90s and living in a nursing home near Farmington then, initially refused to speak with Calloway Wilson. 32:16, after several visits, he relented, though only in general terms would he talk about his early years at the institution. When Calloway specifically mentioned the Hensley Sisters, dramatically changed his demeanor. According to her notes, visibly distressed became Mr. Wilson, gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles whitened. 32:40, forward he leaned and whispered, "Their names we don't speak. Not even after all these years. Still listening there probably." After a long pause, continued Wilson, "From the others kept separate they were. In the East Wing, top floor, 2 attendants at all times outside their door, never the same attendants for more than a week. Doctor's orders said it wasn't safe. In your head somehow could get the older one, she, make you see things, make you do things. In everything followed her lead the younger. By the end, apart anymore couldn't tell them you." 33:02, by not being able to tell them apart, what he meant when Calloway asked, would only say Wilson, changed they did. Both of them changed in ways that weren't possible. That's all I'll say. That's all any of us who worked there will ever say. 33:23, in what would be her final research notes on the Hensley case dated July 14, 1964, wrote Calloway, "From the fair and pleasant girls described in church records to individuals who required restraint, isolation, and ultimately institutionalization, something happened to those sisters that transformed them. Whatever this transformation entailed, disturbing enough that an entire community conspired to erase all memory of it was. Remains the question, what could 2 young women have done? Or perhaps more accurately, what could have been done to them that warranted such extensive measures to obscure their very existence?" 33:45, she continued, "Some form of discovery or exposure that precipitated their transformation suggests the references to a cave and a book. The existence of an unexplored cave system on or near the Hensley property entirely plausible make the geological features of Douglas County. A potential source for the mysterious book mentioned by multiple witnesses provides the family's connection to Reverend Josiah Hensley and his collection of antiquities and manuscripts from the Mediterranean." 34:14, with a disturbing personal observation conclude Calloway's notes, "That I am being watched I cannot shake the feeling. Twice now I've noticed the same dark sedan parked across from my apartment building. Inside remains the driver, face obscured. At odd hours rings my telephone, but never speaks the caller. After returning to my apartment rearranged I've found my research materials, though missing is nothing. To the same paranoia that has surrounded this case for generations am I succumbing? Or a legitimate effort to discourage my investigation is there? And if the latter, such continued vigilance over events that occurred more than 75 years ago what could possibly warrant?" 34:45, never completed her doctoral thesis Sarah Calloway. For personal reasons, she withdrew from the program in August 1964, according to University of Missouri records. For this research were unsuccessful attempts to locate her. In Eugene, Oregon, was her last known address, where as a librarian she reportedly worked until her death in 1987. 35:09, as intensely private described her former colleagues and noted that she refused to discuss her academic past or any research she had conducted in Missouri. However, shared a troubling anecdote one former co-worker, about a year before she died, agitated became Sarah when a patron requested materials about cave systems in the Ozarks. To process the request refused she and took sick leave for the remainder of the week. When she returned, her reaction she would not explain, saying only that some knowledge isn't worth the cost. 35:36, several times over the decades changed hands the Hensley property. Never rebuilt was the house that burned in 1967. Of a cattle ranch is part the land today, the foundations of the original structures barely visible beneath years of overgrowth. Of the property's history before the 1970s report no knowledge the current owners. 35:56, however, in 1982, during the installation of a water line to a new cattle trough, what appeared to be a sealed entrance to an underground space uncovered workers reportedly as an old root cellar or storm shelter that had been deliberately filled in with rocks and then sealed with concrete, described it the foreman, according to an account published in the Ava Monitor. 36:29, to excavate further decided not the property owner, instructing the workers to reroute the water line and rebury the entrance. Questions are what remain. In that spring of 1887, what happened to Eliza and Ruth Hensley? That so terrified their parents and the local authorities. What transformation occurred? That Ezekiel Thornton mentioned what was in the cave? And in their story what role might have played what book? 36:51, answers might have provided the records from Farmington Asylum, but if they still exist, inaccessible they remain. That patient H.E. died in 1901 of complications from prolonged physical restraint indicate patient registers from the period. For patient H.R. is no recorded death date, but from the registry disappears in 1912 with only the notation transferred and no indicated destination. 37:13, by Callaway in the State Archives discovered is an intriguing document, a requisition form dated January 1912 requesting special transport arrangements for a patient being moved from Farmington to the federal facility at M. Not provided is the patient's name, only the notation case HR per Directive 1888. Several specialized medical facilities in the early 20th century maintained the federal government, but which might be indicated by the initial M is unclear. 37:39, by a subsequent researcher who preferred to remain anonymous uncovered is a 1923 internal memo from the Missouri Department of Mental Health that may be relevant, regarding the special case transferred from Farmington to Montauk in 1912. Continued isolation protocols are to be maintained. No visitors permitted. Maintained complete restriction of written correspondence. By Governor's Office required annual verification of security measures. 38:13, on the eastern tip of Long Island, New York, was located Montauk Point, the site of various military installations dating back to the 18th century. That during the early 20th century, for specialized medical research of a classified nature was designated a section of the Montauk Naval Air Station indicate historical records. In 1951 was officially decommissioned the facility and under a 75-year classification order were transferred all records to the National Archives. 38:49, since these events, from even local folklore has faded the story of the Hensley Sisters in the decades. That seems to have been deliberately suppressed this one, unlike many Ozark legends that persist through oral tradition. The systematic removal of their names from county records, the reluctance of locals to discuss the case, and the apparent intervention of state officials in Callaway's research all suggest a concerted effort to erase this chapter of regional history. 39:22, is perhaps most disturbing the possibility that successful was this erasure only because the true details of the case were too unsettling to preserve even as cautionary folklore. On that farm, in that cave, or within that specially constructed outbuilding, what could have happened that warranted such thorough obliteration from historical memory? Few definitive answers but many troubling implications offer the remaining fragments of documentation. 39:46, Perhaps the most chilling passage contains a letter from Sheriff Taylor to the governor's office dated March 1888. To paper the full extent of what we witnessed at the Hensley farm I cannot in good conscience commit. That your decision to authorize extraordinary measures in this matter is both appropriate and necessary for the public welfare can only assure you. At all costs must be contained some contagions of the mind. 40:08. Given the era's limited understanding of mental illness and the tendency to conflate psychological disturbances with moral failings or even supernatural influences is particularly noteworthy this reference to contagions of the mind. But in entirely different terms might today be understood what the sheriff perceived as potentially contagious. 40:38. That is no less disturbing offers a clinical perspective a fragment of a medical report found among the papers Sarah Calloway examined before they were removed from the Historical Society. Subject EH presents with dermatological anomalies unlike any in recorded medical literature. To any known pathology cannot be attributed the texture and pigmentation changes observed. That should not be physiologically possible without surgical intervention reveals ophthalmological examination structural alterations to the iris. With observed pupillary response correlates subject's consistent report of enhanced visual capacity in darkness. Is most concerning the apparent progressive nature of these physical changes and their recent manifestation in subject RH, suggesting communicability heretofore unknown in morphological disorders. 41:06, by a Dr. J.W. Chambers, who is identified as a consulting physician from St. Louis, concludes the report with a recommendation, medically indicated is continued isolation. That the subjects represent a potentially significant public health concern I concur with Sheriff Taylor. Identical to the elder suggests an aggressive contagion vector the rapidity with which the younger subject is developing symptoms. Furthermore, that defies current medical understanding indicates a neurological component the cognitive aberrations observed, specifically the apparent access to information not obtainable through normal sensory channels. 41:30, in 1902, 14 years after the Hensley Sisters were removed from Douglas County, with the circuit court was filed an unusual legal document. For the complete legal dissolution of familial connection to his nieces petitioned Thomas Hensley's brother, William, who had settled in Arkansas. That was granted included language renouncing all blood ties and inheritance, past and future, and contained the unusual stipulation that would never again use the names Eliza or Ruth for their children no member of the extended Hensley family. 41:57, for this extreme measure offers no explanation the petition, but a possible connection suggests its timing shortly after the recorded death of patient H.E. associated with the Hensley sisters was powerful enough that their uncle sought legal means to dissociate his family line from them entirely, whatever stigma. 42:17, Into the Family's Perspective offers a rare glimpse a letter from William Hensley to his son discovered in a family Bible sold at an estate auction in Fayetteville, Arkansas, in 1955. To legally separate our branch of the family from the disgrace that has befallen my brother's daughters I have taken steps. Why the names Eliza and Ruth are forbidden in our household and should remain so for all generations to come I tell you this so that you may understand. Of their own making perhaps was not what happened to them, but no longer human in any way that matters was what they became. This warning remember, can be the deadliest of sin's curiosity. Again can never be closed some doors once opened. 42:39, Thornton's mention of a cave entrance that was sealed following the removal of the Hensley sisters echoes the reference to doors. Several significant cave systems in Douglas County identified geological surveys conducted in the 1950s, including one approximately half a mile from the former Hensley property. 43:01, as Stillhouse Hollow known locally, this cave was explored briefly by university researchers before being declared unsafe due to unstable passages. That while the cave showed signs of occasional human visitation, due to a collapsed passage remained unexplored a significant section notes their report. 43:25, on Ozark cave formations in which he mentioned Stillhouse Hollow only briefly later wrote a monograph one of the researchers, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, that complicates research access carry some local caves cultural baggage. In at least one case, to the primary entrance refused to guide our team residents near a promising cave system and actively discouraged exploration. When pressed, That some things were buried for good reason and that what sleeps should be left sleeping, stated only one elderly resident. 43:35, from an unexpected source comes the last known reference to the Hensley case. In 1928, the same year that certain asylum records were allegedly segregated under executive order, that would have required all counties to maintain complete vital records and prohibited the selective removal of names from historical documents, introduced a bill a state legislator from southern Missouri. 44:11, in the legislative debate, which was not recorded verbatim, he reportedly made reference to the shameful erasure of 2 citizens from Douglas County whose only crime may have been exposure to influences beyond their understanding or control. Failed to pass the bill and did not seek re-election the legislator. 44:36, to the State Historical Society upon his death in 1934 donated, contain no explicit reference to the Hensley case's papers, though a cryptic entry includes a personal journal, again cannot be fully closed some doors once opened. Unknown cannot be some knowledge once obtained. But for what they discover in the darkness must we punish the explorer? 44:47, a possible connection to the Hensley case reveals research into the legislator's background. His wife was the daughter of Dr. Chambers, the consulting physician who examined the sisters in 1888. That Dr. Chambers shared details of the case with his daughter in the years before his death suggests family correspondence, though the precise nature of these revelations remains unknown. 45:04, in the memoirs of Franklin Barnett, who served as a clerk in the state capitol during this period, appears a curious footnote to this legislative episode. Published privately in 1952, include an account of an unusual visit to the legislator. Barnett's recollections: I recall a day when by 2 attendants was escorted into the building an elderly woman. From a private gallery to observe the debate on the Records Preservation Bill she was brought. Though well dressed, about her appearance was something unsettling, a quality I struggle to articulate even now. Somehow wrong seemed her eyes, and strangely fluid were her movements. In a manner that caused me to feel physically ill, I observed her smile when the bill was defeated. As she was led away, as Miss R referred to her one attendant, I overheard and mentioned a return journey to the island facility. 45:32, the younger sister who disappeared from asylum records in 1912 with the notation transferred. Could this woman have been Ruth Hensley? In her mid-50s would place her the timing. For someone to have survived institutional care, certainly possible. With the earlier mention of a transfer to Montauk Point aligns the reference to the island facility. 45:53, but perhaps most significant is Barnett's description of eyes that seemed somehow wrong, echoing accounts of the changes observed in the sisters decades earlier. Largely untold has remained the story of the Hensley sisters in the decades since Sarah Calloway's aborted research. 46:20, on the region's Civil War history, its agricultural development, or its folk traditions typically focus local historians in Douglas County. In county historical publications receives notably little attention the period from 1887 to 1888. In 1976 came an exception when for the American Bicentennial published a comprehensive county history, the Douglas County Historical Society. 46:46, titled Mysteries and Folklore, contained a single paragraph referencing the Hensley case. The volume included a brief section of 2 sisters who vanished from their family farm in the 1880s under unusual circumstances, speaks local legend. Have been preserved no definitive records of this event, while, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of venturing into the countless caves that honeycomb our region, has persisted the story that what happened to the Hensley girls awaits those who explore too deeply beneath the Ozark hills still warn some elders' children. 47:19, in an official county publication, this represents perhaps the only public acknowledgement of the Hensley sisters. As legend and the absence of specific details suggest a continued reluctance to engage directly with the case even nearly a century after the events occurred, does the careful framing. 47:41, in 1992, as part of a broader study of rural mental health practices in the late 19th century, attempted to research the Hensley case a graduate student at Arkansas State University, Daniel Morrison. An intriguing response yielded his records request to the Missouri State Archives, a form letter stating that due to privacy considerations remained under restricted access certain historical records despite the passage of more than a century. 48:04, when Morrison appealed this decision, citing academic freedom and the historical value of the materials, from a state official who informed him that continued pursuit of these specific records could jeopardize his university's state funding arrangements. He received a visit, but included the experience in an appendix to his thesis, noting, "The normal archival restrictions far exceeds regarding the Hensley case the level of institutional resistance I encountered. That whatever transpired in Douglas County in the 1880s was disturbing enough that state authorities continue to actively suppress the details this suggests. After so many generations, what could possibly warrant such persistent censorship, one must wonder." 48:32, merely a set of coordinates on a map is now the site where the Hensley farm once stood. Repurposed the land, gone the structures. Either collapsed or hidden by decades of geological changes and intentional obfuscament is the cave, if it exists. Left no trace the outbuilding with its specialized reinforcements and soundproofing measures. 48:54, long since demolished, has been the asylum that housed the Sisters, replaced by a modern facility with no institutional memory of 19th century patients. With absence are what we left. From historical record, from family lineage, from community memory, the deliberate removal of 2 young women. A story tells this absence itself, one perhaps more disturbing than any explicit account might have been. 49:25, only glimpses gives us the fragmented documentation that briefly came to light in 1964 before being resubmerged in bureaucratic obscurity. 2 sisters transformed by some experience in the spring of 1887, parents terrified of their own children, local authorities willing to go to extraordinary lengths to remove them, not just from the community, but from history itself, a cave, a book, things moving about the house, and voices at night. 49:56, to contemplate what might have occurred on that Ozark farm are we left in the absence of complete records. That some realities are too troubling to acknowledge, some events too unsettling to remember speaks to a collective decision. So fundamentally that they required restraint and isolation for the remainder of their lives. What could change 2 young women? Into collective silence, what could frighten an entire community? That multiple generations would work to ensure its suppression. What knowledge is so dangerous? 50:23, in 2005 emerged a final troubling piece of evidence when during renovation work at the Missouri State Archives was uncovered a sealed metal container behind a section of wall. A single document was inside, a handwritten statement signed by Governor Albert P. Morehouse dated August 1888. In full reads the text, having reviewed the sworn testimonies of Sheriff James Taylor, Dr. Joseph Chambers, and Reverend William Blackwood regarding the condition and behaviors of Eliza and Ruth Hensley, hereby authorize and direct the permanent segregation of these individuals from society. Furthermore, from all public records in Douglas County and the sealing of all documentation related to their case, order either removal of their names. The circumstances described in these testimonies, particularly the physical transformations observed, the inexplicable knowledge demonstrated, and the apparent communicability of their condition, represent a threat to public welfare that transcends ordinary considerations of individual rights. As suspected, should their condition prove to be the result of exposure to materials recovered from the cave system on the Hensley property, permanently sealed and its location obscured, I further direct that said cave be. That the full details of this case must never become public knowledge is my solemn belief. For general dissemination are too dangerous some discoveries. To the orderly function of society and the peace of mind of its citizens are too threatening some phenomena. This necessary act of erasure may God forgive. That these measures are taken not out of cruelty but from the gravest responsibility of governance to protect the many even at the cost of the few, let all who read this understand. 52:25, quickly resealed and transferred to a secure location within the state government complex was this document. By an archivist who chose to remain anonymous when sharing this information was noted its brief emergence. Unknown is the current status of the document, and with denials have been met official requests for confirmation of its existence. 52:50, perhaps in state archives lie the answers, in asylum records segregated under executive order, or in the memories of those who have maintained their silence across decades. Perhaps beneath the soil of a cattle ranch southeast of Ava, Missouri, they lie, where to the earth slowly returned the foundations of a 19th-century farmhouse. 53:18, or perhaps is the most merciful outcome that some stories remain untold, some doors remain closed, some names continue to be absent from the pages of history. As told Sarah Calloway in 1964, Ezekiel Thornton, "Until your dying day stay with you some things once seen. About the Hensley girls heard you only be grateful. From that cave came back they after, into their eyes never looked you be grateful." 53:45, in the summer of 1967, when to the ground finally burned the abandoned Hensley house, as unfortunate described the fire local newspaper accounts. However, revealed a curious detail interviews with emergency responders, though standard procedure would have been to preserve as much of the structure as possible, on ensuring the blaze burned hot enough to consume everything instead focused their efforts firefighters. 54:12, as later commented one retired firefighter, "In that house was nothing anyone needed to find, nothing that should have survived." In 1996, what appeared to be a collapsed cave entrance with remnants of old wooden beams and concrete visible among the limestone debris reported discovering a hiker in the wooded hills southeast of Ava. 54:47, when he returned with county officials several days later, found again could not be the location. That he had been confused about what he had seen claimed the hiker later, recanting his story. As they did when Thomas Hensley first purchased his 80 acres in 1879 look much today the rolling hills southeast of Ava. Some of the once cleared farmland have reclaimed the forests. Through limestone valleys still cuts the White River. 55:15, on quiet nights, say locals that you can hear the distant sound of water moving through underground caves beneath the Ozark soil, a reminder that beneath the visible landscape lies another world, darker and more mysterious, where forever hidden may remain some secrets of Douglas County. 55:47, in 1964, close to uncovering those secrets came Sarah Calloway. To end her academic career and send her across the country as far from the Ozarks as she could reasonably go was enough what she found. To prompt intervention from state officials was enough what she found. The faint outlines of a story about two sisters, a cave, and a transformation so disturbing that an entire community conspired to erase it from memory were what she found. 56:10, and perhaps in the end was that erasure an act of mercy, not just for the community, but for all of us who might otherwise have to confront the full reality of what happened to Eliza and Ruth Hensley in the spring of 1887 among the dark hills of the Ozarks.